Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 7, 1997, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Paul, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent and revise extend my remarks.
That objection is so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I'd like to talk about the subject of monopolies. The American people historically have been very much opposed to all monopolies. The one thing that generally is not known is that monopolies only occur with government support. There's no such thing as a free market monopoly. As long as there's free entry into the market, a true monopoly can't exist. And the particular monopoly that I'm interested in talking about today is the monopoly over money and credit, and that is our Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System did not evolve out of the market. It evolved out of many pieces of legislation that passed over the many years by this Congress. Our founders debated the issue of the central bank, and they were opposed to the central bank. But immediately after the Constitutional Convention, there was an attempt to have a central bank, and the first bank in the United States was established. This was repealed as soon as Jefferson was able to do it. Not too long thereafter, the Second National Bank of the United States was established, another attempt at centralized banking. And it was Jackson who abhorred the powers given to a single bank that abolished the Second National Bank. But throughout the 19th century, there were attempts made to reestablish the principle of central banking. But it wasn't until 1913 that our current Federal Reserve System was established. And since that time, it has evolved tremendously to the point now where it is literally a dictatorship over money and credit. And it works in collaboration with the banking system, where not only can the Federal Reserve create money and credit out of thin air and manipulate interest rates, it also works closely with the banks through the fractional reserve banking system that allows the money supply to expand. This is the source of a lot of mischief and a lot of problems. And if we in the Congress could ever get around to understanding this issue, we might be able to do something about the lowering standard of living which many Americans are now suffering from. If we are concerned about repealing the business cycle, we would have to finally understand the Federal Reserve and how they contribute to the business cycle. Recently, it's been in the news that Alan Greenspan had raised interest rates, and he's received a lot of criticism. There was some recent letters written to Greenspan saying that he should not be raising interest rates. And that may well be true, but I think the more important thing is, why does he have the power and why does he have the authority to even be able to manipulate interest rates? That is something that should be left to the market. Not only is this a monopoly control over money and credit, unfortunately it is a very secret monopoly. As you know, Mr. Speaker, I serve on the Banking Committee, and I'm on the Domestic Monetary Policy Subcommittee. And I myself cannot attend the Open Market Committee meetings. I have no access to what really goes on. I have no authority to do any oversight. There's no appropriation made for the Federal Reserve. And the recent news revealed that the chief of the janitorial services over at the Federal Reserve makes $163,000 a year. And yet we have no authority over the Federal Reserve because it's a quasi-private organization that is not responding to anything the Congress says. Yes, they come and give us some reports about what they're doing, but because Congress has reneged, they no longer have much to say about what the Federal Reserve does. This, to me, is pretty important when you think how important money is. If they have the authority to manipulate interest rates, which is the cost of borrowing, which is a price, as well as the supply of money, this is an ominous power. Because we use the money in every single transaction. It's 50% of every transaction, whether it's the purchase of a good or whether it's the selling of our labor. It is denominated in the terms of what we call the dollar, which doesn't have much of a definition anymore. And yet we have reneged on our responsibility to monitor the Fed to determine whether or not this dollar will maintain value. Now, things have not always been this bad, and it didn't happen automatically in 1913 when the Federal Reserve was established. It took a while, but it's worse now than it has ever been. Matter of fact, a well-known former chairman of the Federal Reserve, William McChesney Martin, had interesting comments to make about this very issue in 1953. Mr. Martin said that, quote, "This is dictated money rates breeds dictated prices all across the board." Well, that's abhorrent to those who believe in free enterprise in the marketplace. And he goes on to say, "This is characteristic of dictatorship. It is regimentation. It is not compatible with our institutions," close quote. So here we have a former chairman of the Federal Reserve System coming down very hard on the concept of control of money and credit. And yet today it is assumed that the Federal Reserve has this authority, and so often it gravitates into the hands of one individual. So those who are levying criticism toward the Federal Reserve today are justified. But if it's only to modify policy and not go to the source of the problem, which means why do they have the power in the first place, it's not going to do much good. So we will have to someday restore the integrity of the monetary system, and we have to have more respect for the free market if we ever expect to undertake a reform of a monetary system which has given us a great deal of trouble, and it's bound to give us a lot more trouble as time goes on. How will this be done? Some argue that the Federal Reserve is private and out of our control, and that is not exactly true. It's secret, but it's a creature of Congress. Congress created the Federal Reserve System, and Congress has the authority to do oversight, but it does not. It refuses and has ignored the responsibility of really monitoring the value of our currency and monitoring this very, very powerful central bank. And there's no doubt in my mind and in the minds of many others that this has to be done. To say that we must just badger a little bit to the Fed and to Greenspan, Mr. Greenspan, and say that interest rates should be lowered or raised or whatever and tinker with policy, I think that'll fall quite short of what needs to be done. What is the motivation behind a Federal Reserve System and central bank? Well, indeed, there are some very interesting motivations because it doesn't happen accidentally. There's a good reason to have a central bank that has this power to, just with a computer, create billions of dollars. And it's not an accident that Congress more or less closes their eyes to it. Between 1913 and 1971, there was a lot more restrictions on the Federal Reserve to do what they're doing today, because at that time we were still making a feeble attempt to follow the Constitution. Because the dollar was defined as a weight of gold, there were restrictions in the amount of new money and credit you could create because of the gold backing of the currency. Although Americans weren't allowed to own gold from the 1930s to 1971, foreigners could. Foreigners could come in and deliver their dollars back to the United States and say, you have to give us $35 an ounce. But that was a fiction too, because by that time we had created so many new dollars that the market knew that it took more dollars to get 1 ounce of gold. But in the process, we gave up a large portion of our gold that was present in our treasury. But why would the Congress allow this, and why would they permit it? Well, I think the reason is Congress likes to spend money, and many here like to tax, and they've been taxing. But currently today, the average American works more than half the time for the government. If you add up the cost of all the taxes and the cost of regulations, we all work into July just to support our government. And most Americans aren't that satisfied with what they're getting from the government. So the taxes can't be raised much more. So they can go out and borrow money. The Congress will spend too much because there's tremendous pressure to spend on all these good things that we do, all the welfare programs and all the military expenditures to police the world and build bases around the world. It takes a lot of money. And there's a lot of interest behind that to spend this money. So then they go and they spend the money, and lo and behold, there's not enough money to borrow, and there's not enough tax money to go around. So they have to have one more vehicle, and that is the creation of money out of thin air. And this is what they do. They send the Treasury bills or the bonds to the Federal Reserve, and with a computer they can just turn a switch and create $1 billion or $10 billion in a single day. And that debases the currency. This diminishes the value of the money and alters interest rates and causes so much mischief that if people are concerned about the economy or their standard of living or rising costs of living, this is the source of the problem. So it's not only with the Federal Reserve manipulating the money and the interest rates, but the responsibility falls on the Congress as well, because the Federal Reserve serves the interests of the Congress in accommodating the Congress as we here in the Congress spend more than we should. Before 1971, when there were still restraints on the Federal Reserve, there was not as much deficit spending. But today, we have, since that time, since the breakdown of the final vestiges of the gold standard in 1971, we have not balanced the budget one single time. So there is definitely a relationship. Now we have a national debt built up to $5.3 trillion, and we keep borrowing more and more. We have an obligation, a future obligation to future generations of $17 trillion. And this obligation is developed in conjunction with this idea that money is something we can create out of thin air. Now, if it were only the accommodation for the excess spending that was the problem, and we just had to pay interest to the Federal Reserve, that would be a problem in itself, but it would not be the entire problem that we face today and that we face in the future. Because as the Federal Reserve manipulates the economy by first lowering interest rates below what they should be and then raising interest rates above to what they think they should be, this causes the business cycle. This is the source of the business cycle. So anybody who is concerned about unemployment and downturns on the economy, rising cost of living, must eventually address the subject of monetary policy. And as a member of the Banking Committee, I am determined that we will once again have a serious discussion about what money is all about and why it is so important and why we in the Congress here can't continue to ignore it and believe that we can endlessly accommodate deficits with the creation of new money. There is no doubt that it hurts the working man more so than the wealthy man. The working man who has a more difficult time adjusting to the rising cost of living is now suffering from a diminished standard of living because real wages are going down. There are many, many statistics now available to show that the real wage is down. Between 1973 and 1997, the wages of the working man has gone down approximately 20%. And this has to do with the changes in the economy, but it also has the changes in the value of the currency, and the wages do not keep up with the cost of living. The increase in the supply of money is called inflation. Even though there are not very many people in the news world or here in the Congress would accept that as a definition, because everybody wants to say that inflation is that which we measure by the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index is merely a technique or a vehicle in a feeble attempt to measure the depreciation of our money. And it is impossible to measure the money's value by some index like the Consumer Price Index. There are way too many variables because the individual who's in a $20,000 tax bracket buys different things than the individual that's in a $200,000 tax bracket. And wages are variables, and the amount of money we borrow, the amount of money we spend on education as well as medicine varies from one individual to another. So this Consumer Price Index, which we hang so much on, is nothing more than a fiction about what we're trying to do in evaluating and accommodating and adjusting to the depreciating value of the dollar.